You had me at Cello, Cello. You had me at Cello. You had me at Cello. Oh, you had me at Cello. Good afternoon, everybody. 5 o'clock on a Friday, time for another episode of Cello Chat. And with me today, I'm thrilled to have Professor Daniel Levitov. It's great to see you, Dan. I hope you're doing well.
I am doing well, Benjamin. It's really great to see you, and thank you so much for having me.
I'm very much looking forward to this. All right, can you begin by telling your musical journey from how you first got started on the cello to how you got where you are today?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's my pleasure. And, I've been so fortunate to have had, this wonderful training. I grew up in Lincoln, Nebraska, which may be not known as much for as a hotbed of string education, but actually it is. And I was very lucky to have just sort of stumbled upon living in a town with a really strong cello background, and also a strong new influx of Suzuki cello, which was brand new when I was a young person. So much so that I started in the Suzuki method, and as I progressed, the books had not yet been printed yet, and so I sort of was working off of these photocopies and pages as they were still sort of collecting materials for the later Suzuki books. But I started actually, my mom took me to a string orchestra concert and said, "What do you like?" And being a young boy, I gravitated towards the largest thing I saw, which was the bass, not the cello. And I said, "That's the one." And unbeknownst to me, my mom had already made a connection with the local cello teacher, Tracy Sands, who still lives in Lincoln, still a great teacher. And she said, "Well, why don't you start on cello? And if you want to go to bass, when you get a little bit bigger, feel free." And of course, I fell in love with the cello and never looked back. But I did start in the Suzuki method, and that was really great for me as a student because, I was not, I'm so lucky now in the position that I have some, extremely motivated students who are, just, racing to practice and work hard. And I was somebody who really benefited from a teacher who, understood motivational tools for kids like practice charts and stickers and, little listening competitions and things like that. And so, that really drew me in. And before I knew it, I was very much immersed. And I would also say that I very much benefited from the social aspect of the Suzuki training that I got, having group cello lessons. And some of the friends that I made really, truly at age 5 and 6 when I started cello are some of my best friends still today from those early group cello classes. So I was very, very lucky. I suppose, like many of us, as I was growing to love the cello, I found a summer music festival experience to be very formative for me. And I first went to the Suzuki camps in Stevens Point, Wisconsin, which you probably know. And I went twice. I went once, as a young kid with my parents, and then once on my own when I was a little bit older. And really, found that community of musicians that really appealed to me. And then as I got the next level of that, as I went to a more advanced camp in Colorado, and there was the first time where, and this was probably late middle school for me, where I really felt like these are my people. And I would say, as much as I love music, and I really did, I was always a lover of music. And right about that time, I kind of phased out my listening of more popular music and really became a nerd and listened to the music that now I'm pretty much immersed in. But really, even more than the music, it was the people who I felt like these are my people, and through that process, I think I learned more about advanced study. I saw, for the first time, some of my friends were, sitting in a room for a few hours and practicing. And I really was like, well, what are they doing? And I hadn't had that experience of deeply immersive, intense study. And through that summer in Colorado, I think when I emerged out of that, I was really ready to go for it. As I entered high school, I was lucky to study for a year and a half with Charles Tucker, who was a Pariso student, doctoral student, who was sort of sent out into the field to Nebraska. And he was great, cello nerd, lover of Popper and, all those kinds of things. And I was really ready to be challenged in that way, where he would ask me to, come up with different fingerings on the spot for the same passage and really sort of challenge my intellect, which really appealed to me. And then finally, as I was getting ready for college auditions, I studied with Carol Work, who is probably the most well-known teacher in Lincoln, Nebraska, having taught a couple of professional cellists who are still out there in the world, including Mark Johnson of the Vermeer Quartet and Kim Cook, who's at Penn State, and some others. Each of those teachers was really different for me. So I had this very nurturing and supportive teacher, which is exactly what I needed as a young person. And then I had kind of a tough but kind teacher in Mr. Tucker, who really got me kind of excited. And then by the time I got to Carol Work, I was very motivated myself. And she kind of became more of a collaborator when we kind of worked together and practice. And it was so interesting. She was such a gifted teacher because and she opened my eyes to teaching in many ways, because she was somebody who was a different teacher for each student who came to her studio. And so I would come early to a lesson and hear her, really going at a student saying, you need to prepare this and and then she would come to me, and I didn't need that because I was already at that moment in my life very motivated, and it was a different tone completely. And she really nurtured my interest in teaching. We talked about the studio, and as soon as I went off to college, I went to Oberlin Conservatory and studied with Peter Raito there. Every time I came back to Nebraska, Carol would say, okay, well, you're going to teach a masterclass for my students, or you're going to, work. And so I started teaching. I was already doing a little bit of teaching in high school, but I went to college or to conservatory, maybe very unusually, wanting to be a teacher performer already. Like I had already made that as my career choice. And I was also very fortunate in working with Mr. Raito, that he was somebody who was very open to talking to me about, understanding technique. He came from a science background, and all of his degrees were actually in science and engineering, and really interested, like the study of the cello, understanding the instrument and thinking about different players and what their needs were. And also he just had supremely wonderful musical taste. And I really appreciated that as well. From Oberlin, I went to Manhattan School of Music and studied with David Gaber and also with Julia Lichten. Got my master's degree there. And then I started a doctoral program. I continued my work with David and Julia. My degree is from City University, so I went to City University, which has it was an interesting switch for me, because it's such a musicology focused school that even though I was there for a DMA in cello performance, even the performance degree has a very sort of a high bar for the research element, and so my dissertation was pretty significant, I actually didn't complete it until I was already working in Baltimore, where I am now, and if I can just backtrack a little bit to something uncello related, which is that I met my future wife at Oberlin. She's a wonderful violist and violin teacher too, although professionally she's the assistant principal viola of the Baltimore Symphony, Karen Brown. So we met at Oberlin, started playing chamber music together, and then I'm 2 years older, so I came to New York first, and then she came to Juilliard. And then what brought us to Baltimore was that she won the audition with the Baltimore Symphony, and so that moved us down to Baltimore. But even before I came, her colleague at that time in the New York Philharmonic, Alan Stepansky, who teaches at Peabody Conservatory, said, "Hey, we're looking for a cello teacher at Peabody Preparatory." So I actually was very fortunate to move to a new city already with a job in hand. I came down for an interview before we moved to Baltimore. And we've been in Baltimore since 2001, so a long time now. My positions now at the Peabody Preparatory, I'm the assistant chair of the string department, associate chair of the string department, specializing in lower strings. We have two associates, one upper and one lower. And I also direct our chamber music program. And I conduct the middle of our three preparatory orchestras, which is called the Young Artists Orchestra. And then I also direct the string ensembles at the Bryn Mawr School, which is a private or independent K through 12 school in Baltimore, where my twin daughters also attend, and they must get tired of me. They say they don't, but they're a violinist and cellist, and they're also with me at Peabody playing in my orchestra. So it's kind of they're 9.5 now, and it's fun to have them kind of along for the ride.
Absolutely. Wow, that's great. So even in your description, for example, the fact that you're talking about not just the nerding out on the music, but the people, that already speaks to your really lifelong passion for chamber music as well. I mean, of course, chamber music involves any and all instruments, but something about the varied hats that we wear in what is written for us for cello, where we go from the bass line to an inner voice to the melody and back and forth. I think there's lots of opportunities in just teaching in general to kind of keep your chamber music hat on at all times. And then you're also a conductor, like you mentioned. How do all of these things inform just even the teaching of a private lesson? Your conducting chops, your chamber music approach, your Suzuki background.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question, and there's so many directions to go with that. And I do feel like, and I did develop a love of chamber music at a young age, and maybe we all just love that intimacy, the equality of parts, and the special form, especially of a string quartet. And I'm lucky to play in a string quartet with some colleagues, this Clipper Mill String Quartet. But your question about like how each of those facets of my life informs my teaching is a really interesting one. I think as a teacher, I like to think of myself as someone who's really focused on drawing out the individual voice of my students, and also someone who's not developing someone who's sort of technically a good cellist, but someone who understands music. And I think, maybe perhaps it's, sitting in front of an orchestra and seeing the whole score and how it fits together, or, analyzing a string quartet, or, but I really encourage my students to really, feel like they are connecting with the whole score, and searching for the voice of the composer, and their voice, and finding that harmony, that connection that we have to the music that we play. So I feel really lucky actually that I teach such a wide range of students. I mean, I have students who are total beginners and very young, 4 or 5 years old, all the way up to very advanced conservatory level students and beyond. And what I've done in the past, especially in the past maybe 10 years, is I start to think of those beginning students like they're on that journey towards that concert. So when you're teaching, those early pieces or first scales, or, that you're thinking about, well, how would you approach this artistically, or how would you approach this, stylistically? Can we introduce these advanced bow strokes at a beginning level so that we can grow that process. And one of the fun things about teaching prep is to be able to have students a long time. I did teach college for a few years, more than a few years at Gettysburg College in their conservatory. And I enjoyed that too. It was really great. But to have a student for 10 years, 12 years, 14 years even, before they go off to college, it's an incredible privilege. And also a big responsibility, because you really have to take them all the way. And that's neat. And I really enjoy that.
Excellent. Well, and it sounds like, the interest in how the music works, sounds like even if you had not been kind of required at City University of New York to have had the extra high musicological bar, you probably would have gone that way anyway.
It's possible. Yes, I had a minor in music history at Oberlin, so I was already sort of thinking about musical structure and sort of the genealogy of music and how it develops, and thinking about how one piece relates to it. Like if I'm studying a Beethoven cello sonata, well, what else was Beethoven writing at that time, and who else was writing music, and how does this compare?
Excellent. It's also fascinating.
It is.
Well, and then from the motivation standpoint too, you mentioned the sorts of devices. I don't know what else word to use, just like the various ways in a Suzuki program or in other programs as well to have practice charts and little rewards from time to time. But I mean, and I know that there's of course going to be a high degree to which we have to tailor the way we help motivate a student to what that particular student is and needs. But do you have some general thoughts about your approach to motivating students?
I do. Yeah, it's interesting, that I grew up with this very, like sort of like goal or reward oriented kind of teaching, which worked well for me. And I think that my teaching is a little bit different than that. I mean, I'm a very nurturing teacher, very positive teacher. And I really believe in that. But I believe that for me, that I feel the most motivated when I'm challenged and intrigued. And I find that, asking students to sort of stretch a little bit and having them think sort of beyond is an incredibly motivating tool. And so that's sort of the motivational tool that I use, is sort of, thinking about something that's a stretch or a reach, or imagining that, this is the step here and this is where we're getting to. I really believe in challenging my students, especially challenging them artistically. And I very specifically, my orchestra at Peabody, I very specifically called them the Young Artist Orchestra, because I think that they're mostly a middle school aged orchestra with some high school and some younger, but they're all pretty good players. And to me, that is the perfect time to like develop that young artistry. And so that's very thrilling for me to be able to see that and identify that in my students, and then to draw it out and encourage it. Now, when it comes to like specifically sort of like the grind of practicing, because we all know, practicing can be a grind, and it needs to be regular, and we can't just practice when we feel inspired or motivated. We have to practice those other times too. I think it's important, first of all, just to acknowledge that, I think sometimes a young student thinks that we as the cello teacher must just, love it every moment. And sometimes I do. And sometimes it's just, you just have to put in your time and get it done. And other times you get unexpected joy out of doing that. So it's kind of interesting. But I really do, think about what students, I have some students who they get really excited about listening, not necessarily to the piece that they're playing, but like, if I say, well, we're playing Lalo Concerto, and, if we're playing Lalo Concerto, let's immerse ourselves in the world of opera, because I really feel that that's a very operatic concerto, and let's listen to this opera, and that's really going to turn on, that kind of a student. And then I have, maybe another student who's a real analytical thinker, who wants to, work through a Bach cello suite and really think about like, well, what keys are we moving through, and how do we get there, and what are the moving notes, and what are the stable and unstable notes, and and to really look at something very structurally or very harmonically. And I have other students who are really wrapped up in the narrative of music, and they are looking to tell stories with sound, and we can find ways to do that. One of the things that I do in my teaching, which I think is important, is that we take these very abstract ideas like character or mood or emotion in music, and I say, well, okay, well, how do I translate that into cello playing? And the analogy that I sometimes give to my students is that I can imagine a beautiful painting, but I don't have the skills to create that painting. So if I can imagine it perfectly in my mind, and you handed me a paintbrush, it would not look the way I imagined it, to say the least. But what we're trying to develop with cello playing is we're trying to have that same imagination, that picture in our mind of what the sound sounds like, or, where the phrase is going. And then we have to take each element of that and say, well, what cello language can I use? What does that mean for my contact point or my vibrato or the changing of my bow speed? What does that mean for where I am in the bow? And use all of, translate that abstract image or idea into something that's very concrete. So we're actually working on the technique of artistry, or the technique of musicianship.
Great. Yeah, well said. And because that is, trying to bake the musicality right into the technique from a young age. And, and I've heard you at enough sessions at Astor, for example, we've both been to the master classes with some of the younger players. And it is interesting, wouldn't you say, how quickly you can kind of tell whether a given youngster has incorporated that whether it's telling a story through sound, but that musical sense of it's going here and then it comes away there. And aside from the degree to which they've developed their technical chops by that age, some of them have an astounding amount of musical maturity.
It's true.
How young and small
it's very true, and some of them, and some of them don't, and then we have to find ways to bring that out because it is in there somewhere. I have a student right now who has a lot of that musical maturity that you're talking about, and she's a very gifted student, and it's easier for her to express it in sound than it is in words. And so sometimes we talk about how important actually that language is, whether, first of all, if you want to become a cello teacher someday, you have to develop that language, but also if you want to play chamber music or be a principal cellist and speak to your section, how important it is to do sort of reverse engineering. Like I can feel it. I know that, I feel that phrase very innately, but then if I can't describe it or share it to my friends and colleagues or students, then that's a limitation too.
Now, there is another area that cellists have not necessarily broached as fully as other instruments, and that's the jazz world. And you've recorded a jazz CD and played in a jazz festival. Can you talk a bit about how you went about doing that and what you think might be the attitude or approach that a cellist should take if they've got a little bit of trepidation about jazz, but also kind of think that'd be really fun?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I have to, really claim that I came to the jazz world from a very ignorant place, sadly. And I do think that's something that's kind of missing in our training. That's maybe, that's an area that we need to make sure that we fill. But I was really lucky to marry into a jazz family, which is that my wife is a classical violinist and violist, but her dad, Ray Brown, not the famous bass player Ray Brown, but another famous Ray Brown, who's a flugelhornist composer and arranger, and a vibraphone player. He's truly one of the most gifted musicians of any genre of music that I know. He played on the Stan Kenton band for a number of years, and his father, Glenn Brown, played on the Xavier Cugat band, and was one of the very first people who brought jazz education into the public schools. So he was a jazz educator. And so I was already in conservatory before I had exposure to jazz, other than just enjoying jazz, which I always have. But I came into the family, and it was sort of like, okay, well, my wife, she sang jazz standards with her family and did a little bit of playing. And so the first exposure that I had was we're playing some of the arrangements of my future father-in-law, now my father-in-law. And I just really fell in love with it. And it was through that channel that I sort of like opened myself up, and I think especially opened myself up to the rich harmonic language of jazz, which really appeals to me a lot. I just love the colorfulness of jazz, and also just from my, now a little bit about me, and I enjoy musical structure and harmony, and there's so much of that in jazz, harmonic progressions that could be found in music of Bach or something like that. And I find that just totally fascinating. So that was my entry into the jazz world. And I was able to play in the Monterey Jazz Festival Orchestra in the Monterey Jazz Festival for a number of years. I'm not sure if it's still going on. They always had one show with a full orchestra. And I was able to play in that orchestra for a number of years and play with, Charlie Hayden and Terrence Blanchard and many others. And that's where I was able to meet Roy Hargrove and record Moment to Moment, which was his album of trumpet and flugelhorn with strings. And he was a beautiful player. Unfortunately, died very young, sadly. Beautiful player, and recorded that in the Beach Boys studio in Big Sur, which was kind of a fun experience. So since that time, I've played a little bit more, and I think it started in the pandemic. My family, my wife and my twin daughters, we started to record some jazz standards arranged by my father-in-law for the Baltimore Symphony Facebook page and for the Baltimore Symphony Musicians Facebook page. And I think you could probably find those. So the Levitov Brown Family Band. And so we've recorded some Christmas stuff, some 4th of July tunes, sort of holiday oriented. We did a Valentine's Day, My Funny Valentine. So that's been sort of a regular thing. And that's been really fun to make music with my family, and just fascinating to me to hear these two, very young kids who started doing, they're 9 now, but they started doing it when they were 6. Really play jazz and really like hear these harmonies and hear like complex rhythmic, relationships. And that's really fun for me.
I'll bet it is. Now let's see. I think the whole country has adapted in some way, shape, or form to the kind of the technology situation we went through during the COVID couple of years. You have an online cello pedagogy masterclass that's both in person and online coming up. Would you talk about what that is and how that evolved a bit?
Yeah. So this is through the Peabody Preparatory or Peabody Pro. It's and there's a series of online masterclasses and workshops. This year there were, I think, 4 violin ones and 2 cello ones. And it's been, really nice. I've done a couple of online workshops, over the pandemic to be able to connect with teachers. This particular one is sort of focused on this idea that I've already spoken about a little bit today about building artistry and musicianship and technique, from young ages through advanced, especially thinking about using lyrical pieces, short lyrical pieces, as kind of a launching off point for thinking about sort of advanced artistry. And the way that this particular class is structured is that I'll be in a room with whatever participants are in our area, but also with a couple of students, maybe 1 or 2 of mine, but maybe also 1 or 2 of my colleagues. And we'll have a masterclass focused on specifically on this idea. And then there'll be an online group joining as well. And then after the students are done, there's sort of we open it up for discussion, sort of a broader discussion about pedagogy, with both the online and in-person people. Excellent.
And what other things do you have in the works for 2023? We're coming up on the ASTA conference, and then I know you always are doing a lot in the summers and performances.
Exactly, yeah. So my string quartet has a performance coming. We just had a big concert, and we're I think our next concert in April is on the Baltimore Symphony Orchestra's chamber music series. So we're just playing one piece on that series, and we're playing the Amy Beach String Quartet in One Movement, which, if you don't know that quartet, it's a really fantastic piece. And we've already performed it once, and we're really looking forward to giving it a second run. It's just a beautiful, beautiful piece and very interesting. So that's coming up from a performance standpoint. In the summer, I'm really excited to be joining the faculty of HEMA USA. This is HEMA. It was a festival that originated in Iceland. It's HIMA. And it's directed by Sibbe Bernhardsson, who's a violin professor at Oberlin Conservatory, and his wife, Sally Takata. And it's good. This one, the HEMA USA, is in Lakeside, Chautauqua, Ohio, kind of a little resort community, and it's a week-long camp for talented or gifted kids ages 7 to 12. So it's kind of a fun age of younger kids who are serious and advanced and are looking for chamber music's masterclass, technique class lessons. So that's going to be really fun.
Nice. Excellent. And what Orlando?
Unfortunately, this year I'm not doing Orlando. It just didn't quite work out in my family schedule, just because of it happened to line up with the kids' spring break. So we're taking a little vacation this time. But I already made plans to come to the next one, so I'm really looking forward to that.
Terrific. Well, hopefully our paths will cross sometime between now and then. But best of luck to you with the whole, as we come out of COVID, hopefully more and more, and audiences kind of start becoming more regular.
Well, it's been interesting, isn't it? Of course, we're so glad to be able to, to teach in person and see our students in person. But, the technology that, you and I are having this conversation right now has just created all this sort of to me, different ways of teaching that now, sort of a regular part of my teaching is a student sends me a video, 30-second video. Hey, I'm having a little trouble with this, or they text me a couple measures and say, this is the fingering that I have in my orchestra piece, but I mark it up on my phone and send it right back to them, or I make a short video for them, little demonstration. I had a student who was feeling some tension right here, on their left hand. I made just a quick little demo video, let's practice a Kosman exercise this way and think about this, So I love this feeling of connection with my students through the week without it feeling like it's encroaching on, on life. And I'm really happy to have the in-person lesson, but also happy to have this technology that continues to connect us.
Yeah, that's an excellent perspective. It really has in many ways a good silver lining. Well, thanks so much for your time and your thoughts, Dan. They're very inspiring.
It's my pleasure. It's really a great conversation. Thank you so much.
All right, excellent. And audience out there, happy practicing all week. We'll see you this time next Friday. Take care.